If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. Rangers, campers, hunters, and the like, share your most bizarre and scary encounters with forest demons, haunted woods, lost trails, and any other freaky experiences you've had in the deep woods. I was once in the woods in Galena, on the trail beside the golf course, riding my bike with my dog for our daily exercise. It was dusk and somewhat smoky. This was in 2020. We sat down at a clearing where the creek is pretty still, and it sits right next to some abandoned farming equipment and some huge bushes. My dog jumped across the creek and disappeared for a while. I called, and when he wouldn't come back, I started to panic a little. I could see the bushes rustling, but he didn't care that I was getting scared. It was very strange for him. He almost always comes right back. He finally decided to rejoin me, and when he did, I saw out of my peripheral vision a large black shape about 20 feet in the air behind a large pine tree. If you know the area I'm describing, then you know that the pines at this clearing are massive. It quickly disappeared behind the tree, and I kept telling myself it was a bird, but I knew deep down it wasn't. It moved way too slowly to be a bird, and nothing ever came out of the other side of the tree. And the shape of it was kind of long, but it had no wings or anything like that. When I tell you that every hair on my body stood up, I mean that. I was shaking like a leaf, hopping right back onto my bike and booking it back home. Ever since then, I have always been very nervous about going back to the areas where the trees appear to have eyes all over them. On a night in 2006 or 2007, I guess, I noticed a campfire in the distance, and I went to investigate as setting up camps in this area was not allowed as conservation efforts were in place. I walked over, no one was here, and I wondered why idiots would let a fire go unattended. So I went over there. There were about 2 tents, from what I remember, and no one was there. I radioed in and asked for a couple of guys to come to clean up. When they arrived, I went to look for any signs that people were around. I looked around for a couple of minutes and didn't find anything. Then we all left after extinguishing the fire and clearing up. We had one guy stay there as we had unattended equipment. Then I went back to the office. I was due a break. After the break, I went out and saw a group of 3 who seemed fairly distressed. I approached them and asked them what they were doing down this neck of the woods, and they said that they were camping and had been told to leave their campsite immediately. I became suspicious as we had no rangers working there. I asked them who they saw, and they said that he was wearing very old-fashioned clothes and that he supposedly had no face. At this point, shivers were sent down my spine. I told them to go and collect their equipment, and they went to get their equipment. Then I saw them leaving. I have only mentioned this to my friend, who has worked in the park since 2006. He hasn't had any reports of such things up to this day. This is one of my scariest stories. I still have no clue what happened, but when hearing that in the dark and in the middle of the woods, shivers were sent down my spine. Living in SoCal, one of our favorite pastimes is hiking. Looking for a new trail on the internet, we came across Altadena Haunted Forest. Now it looks cool and seems naturey, so I'm down, and I also don't believe in the whole haunted thing. So we get the squad, 8 of us, roommates, his girlfriend, and her friends, and go and get there, thanks to traffic, at 9 p.m. Well, we hike, everything is cool, we see the city lights, nothing unusual, nothing scary. Well, around 1 a.m., we decide to go back, leave the forest, and walk towards our car. We were walking downhill, and going up the hill came a girl on a bike. She was black with dark hair and had a yellow plaid skirt and a shirt on at 1 a.m. in the fall. As she rode closer, though, nothing else seemed weird. But when I tried looking at her face, well, there was nothing. Just like a blur, a black hole, or something that sucks the light up. As soon as she passes us, the 8 of us all stop, look at each other, and one of the girls asks, "Could you guys see her face?" Well, that was fun enough already. We just rode back, ignoring her, but when we get home, or at least the next morning, I Google that place and see that there are reports of faceless figures appearing around that forest. You know, we didn't go back. Duck. It was a couple summers ago when my family and some friends went camping in Mount Hood National Forest, Oregon. My friends, 4 of us total, all stayed in one tent, and the adults got their own separate tents. It was like a tent city. It was around 2 or 3 a.m. when we started to get ready to go to sleep. We were all in our tent getting dressed when we started to hear voices. It was faint, but it was there. We just assumed it was one of our parents, even though we knew they were all asleep. I have always been afraid of the dark, and I still am to this day. I had gotten a bad feeling in my stomach and tried to brush it off because I didn't want to look like a chicken in front of my friends. Everyone but me felt asleep, all I could hear were those voices. About an hour after the voices started, my friend Viv sat up. She rocked back and forth, but her eyes were still closed. I didn't move, I was too scared to look straight at her. I was watching her from my peripherals. After 5 minutes of this, she stood up and started to laugh. Not loudly or anything, just a small chuckle. But she didn't stop, it was mechanical sounding, like a robot. I was afraid she wasn't getting enough air. She started to pace around the tent. It's 7 feet tall and 15 feet long. She stopped at the side of the tent facing the woods and just pointed. At this point, her eyes were wide open, and her laugh was high-pitched and fast. I swear to God there was another figure on the other side pointing back at her. The figure was deformed, tall, and skinny, not human-looking. I realized the voices stopped, and it ended as quickly as it started. She just stopped laughing, dropped her hand, climbed back in her sleeping bag, and closed her eyes. In the morning, I told her she was sleeping, walking, and talking but didn't get into the details. Since then, I haven't asked her to go camping with me again. I haven't asked her to sleep over. I was at my aunt's house in Ohio, and she lost her dog, Penny, in the woods behind her house. Me, my sister, and my aunt got flashlights and went out looking for the dog. I got lost somehow, even though I looked away for just a moment. I started smelling static in the air, and my flashlight was dead at this point. I was yelling for my aunt or my sister, but nobody answered. I was walking around in search of the tree line when I heard fast footsteps. I turned around and saw a thin stick figure running at me, waving its arms like those things outside car dealerships. I ran as fast as I could and eventually got out and fell unconscious. When I woke up, we were driving home, and I never told my parents what happened. Please give me advice. When I was in college, 2 friends and I decided to go camping kind of randomly one weekend, and it was the middle of winter. We thought maybe we could do a moonlight hike since there were quite a few trails near where we set up. So we drive up this ridge about 4 p.m., set up our site, get our snuggly gear on, and, of course, we were young and dumb, lol, we then decide to start our hike. By this time, it was about 8:30 or 9-ish, the moon was rising, and we set out. About 20 minutes into it, we start to hear what sounds like a fricking flute. Like an unearthly and beautiful sound. Faded in and out, like when someone is messing with an old-fashioned radio. We are in the middle of nowhere, with a full, beautiful moon and bazillion stars out, and as far as we know, there isn't anyone else around for at least 50 miles, excepting the ranger station, which we drove past on our way up. So we make some jokes, then get back to kind of chatting and walking. Myself and one of my other friends had never done a night hike before, nor were either of us very familiar with the area. Suddenly, we realize we are at the edge of a field. And it is a huge, completely untouched, fresh blanket of snow sparkling in the moonlight. One of the most beautiful things I've ever seen, and we pause, and my friend who is leading us says to wait. He doesn't remember there being a clearing in this area. Okay, maybe we got turned around, it happens, but we were in good hands. Friend 3 was an experienced outdoorsman, he scouted the whole 9. We make the decision to retrace our steps and head back to camp, and suddenly, we hear that flute again. This time, though, it sounded much closer. It was beautiful, I don't know how to describe it other than as lonely and full of longing and grief. My second friend and I asked at nearly the same time, "Do you guys frickin' hear that?" And we all did. We started walking back the way we came, and as we were walking, we realized that there were small, almost human-looking footprints in our previous tracks, like something had been walking behind us. We kept hearing that flute all the way back to our site. It was extremely unnerving, and we agreed that it sort of sounded like it was underwater and coming from several directions at once. At that point, we decided to pack our shit back up and go back to my house, where they crashed on the floor and couch, respectively. We weren't on drugs, we hadn't had more than a beer or 2 each, and we ate before we started walking. I can't logically explain it considering where we were, how isolated we were, the fact we all heard it, and how strange it sounded. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I'm sure there's probably a reasonable explanation, but I don't know what it would be. Later, when retelling this story to another friend, they said it sounded like a cocopelli, not quite sure what that is. When I was in 7th grade and living in Richmond, Virginia, I was best friends with a guy whose parents ran a dental clinic way out in Bumduck, Virginia. They lived in Richmond but had a small house with a ton of land out near the practice where one parent would stay and work while the other looked after the household in Richmond, switching every week. My friend and I loved going out there on weekends. The land was beautiful and super explorable. It was a beautiful fall day, and we had been having the time of our lives riding dirt bikes through miles of trails through his woods before deciding to hop off the bikes and walk deeper off the beaten path. We walked straight into the woods for quite a while, probably several miles into woods that certainly nobody had walked through for quite a while. We all know the eerie feeling that can occur when you're deep in the woods. Things seem kind of quiet, and you feel a presence. We had stopped talking, and I think we both felt it when we came across a wooden structure. It was clearly a dwelling and clearly hadn't been lived in for decades upon decades. It was very well built, seriously, it looked like it was built in an almost frontier style, but it was still very much standing. That was when it happened. The deep silence was pierced with something I can only describe as a banshee scream. It came from each direction at once and physically hurt our ears. We turned and ran. As we ran, we heard the entire building behind us collapse in grand fashion. The scream is now supplemented with splintering wood being torn apart and falling to the ground. We never looked back as we ran. Being a 13-year-old boy, I was much braver than my current 21-year-old addition. We ran for a while, caught our breath, and immediately went back. I seriously can't even imagine having those brass balls today. I don't know what we were expecting to find, but it certainly wasn't what we did. There it was. Perfectly untouched. The building we had heard make a sound like a freight train as it collapsed behind us was sitting just as it was when we first found it, untouched by time. We entered. There were dirt floors and some old, handmade furniture, like chairs and a chest of drawers. Those were the immediate sights. We walked through a doorway and were greeted with the sight of what I can only describe as piles of rotting, ripped, blood-stained clothing and 3 nooses hanging over a beam in the ceiling. We ran almost as fast as we had the first time, wordlessly, all the way back to the dirt bikes, rode home, and didn't sleep a wink that night. I believe in the supernatural. There is no logical explanation for anything that happened that day. This weekend, I went hiking with my boyfriend and a few of his friends. The 5 of us were heading up a not-so-popular mountain trail that's about 10 miles long up to a small lake. We saw 2 couples on their way down, but no one passed us on the way up. The trail isn't super easy, and wildlife is pretty common. We saw a moose about 3 miles in, so we were all on guard for more moose, a mountain lion, or anything else that could cause a problem. After the moose, we ran into a small patch of snow that was maybe 100 feet along the trail. Past the snow, we walk another 20 to 30 yards and find a deer's rib cage and spine. We gathered around it, not saying much, and one of the guys turned it over with a stick. It's totally clean. After we stand up, an older guy is standing like 10 feet away, just staring at the group of us. Not one of us heard or saw him walk up. It was like he just appeared. After we make eye contact with him, he just turns to his right, jumps over the little creek, cutting through 12 to 18 of snow, and walks up the side of the mountain, disappearing into the tree line, making plenty of noise. I was with an outdoor group back when I was a teenager. We were in the western US for 2 weeks and planned to spend 1 week rafting and the next hiking through the canyons. One night during the first week, the weather was beautiful, and we all decided to skip pitching tents and just sleep under the stars. After a few hours of telling stories about growing up and where we all came from, we'd all only just met, we drifted off to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of shuffling. I looked around, but it was so dark that I couldn't really see anything, so I just assumed the sound was people tossing and turning in their sleeping bags. I had a dream that night that I was dragging myself across the floor of my kitchen because my legs wouldn't work. It was kind of eerie, but when I woke up, I didn't really think much about it until I sat up and saw where I was. My sleeping bag, as well as everyone else's in my group, had been dragged at least 10 feet towards the riverbank. You could actually see the trail on the ground where each person was dragged from where they were originally sleeping. We were all freaked out, of course. First jumping to the possibility of someone in the group playing a practical joke. But honestly, everyone seemed equally spooked, and no one in the group remembers waking up and seeing anything. Additionally, each person had drag marks behind their sleeping bag, meaning that if it was someone in our group, they'd have had to weigh their own bag down with something heavy and drag it to leave a mark matching everyone else's. Totally possible, but definitely a little extra. We spent the next week and a half in the wilderness together, and no one ever fessed up. Other than hearing a few weird noises echoing through the canyon, nothing super spooky happened after that. I still get creeped out thinking about that night, though. So yesterday, my boyfriend and I went hiking along the coast. The Pacific Northwest has a gorgeous coastline, and it's our goal to traverse all of the coastal trails. I'm on vacation all this week, so we decided to hit a trail south of where we live. He hadn't even been on this trail, so we were both looking forward to it. The trail is part of the state park system and leads to cliffs overlooking the Pacific. Interestingly, this state park is rarely, if ever, frequented. It sits at the end of a dead-end road near a municipal airport. We literally saw no one there, even the airport gates were locked up tight. There wasn't even a formal parking lot, just a dirt drive with the usual state park signage about being closed after sundown. So we follow the trail, which leads past the airport and then southwest into the woods. By and large, it was nice and peaceful. It was only about 2 miles to the cliffs. We were having a good time, laughing and chatting. That changed about a half-mile away from the cliffs. The closer we got to the cliffs, the quieter it got. The birds stopped, and even the sound of the wind lessened. Then we both got the weird feeling we were being watched, and who or whatever it was not happy we were there. My boyfriend rounded a curve and stopped to do a double take. He swore he saw a woman standing in the woods. She had very white skin and black hair that was shoulder length and messy. She wore a gray sweater with a cowl neck, very 80s, was how he described it. He didn't see any legs, and she vanished right in front of him. I never saw her, but I definitely felt her. We kept moving, went and saw the ocean, and then headed back. The minute we passed the tree line, we were being watched again, and it was not happy. You could feel the air, it was heavy and very uncomfortable. We picked up the pace, and soon the feeling of being watched went away. We both felt like whatever it was couldn't go past a certain point. They were trapped there. With this being the Pacific Northwest and the harsh reality that killers have run amok up here in the past 50 years, there's a good chance there's a victim or someone buried in those woods somewhere. We have no proof of that, but given the number of women that have been killed here and in the state next to us and then dumped in the woods, it seems pretty likely our thoughts on the situation are correct. A few years ago, I went on a solo overnight camping trip in the Rocky Mountains. I hiked in about 7 miles, seeing only a few day trippers on the way in, and got to what I thought was a secluded area to set up camp. Typically, people that hike in this area carry some sort of large firearm to defend themselves from grizzly bears, but I was only carrying a bear fogger and a 7-inch K-bar combat knife. I always follow best practice when it comes to tying up food away from the campsite, which I did that night as well, but since my tent was a small one-man tent, I left my backpack hanging on a tree near my tent. Anyway, at some point in the middle of the night, I heard some rustling outside my tent. My heart started to race, but I had my knife and bear spray in my sleeping bag with me, so I took the safety of the spray, unbuttoned the sheath on the knife, and clutched them, waiting for the worst to happen. There was a babbling creek nearby, so I wasn't sure if the rustling sound stopped, but I couldn't be sure. I woke in the morning alive, so I got out of the tent, and my bag was unzipped, but nothing was missing. I was pretty spooked, so I packed up and started to hike out, and I stopped by a little lake. I turned around, and there was this old man standing about 5 feet behind me. He said, "You picked a nice camping spot last night." I noped the duck out of there. I was a little relieved that I wasn't hearing things the night before, and the mystery was solved. One time on the logging roads of Silverton, Oregon, me and a family friend had a rock thrown at our truck windshield. It left a chip or dent in the glass. No one else was up there with us. We saw trees broken in straight lines about 8 feet in the air, all over the place, and something paced me in the trees. Another time, my brother and I were camping in the coastal range near Pacific City, Oregon. We were in the middle of the wilderness, away from any hiking trail where no one really goes. After we got in our tent, everything got dead silent, and someone or something big on 2 legs started walking around our tent at midnight. I eventually walked right up to and stood within inches of the tent, and when I unzipped the fly and shined my flashlight out, nothing was there. Our flashlights kept on dying throughout the night, and eventually, we left because the experience creeped us out. It was a very strange feeling, for sure. My brother confessed he'd been seeing weird figures in the tree line throughout the evening but hadn't said anything before because he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. My cousin and his buddy have heard whoops, mumble chatter, and got bluff charged while in their tent while hunting deer down around Roseburg, Oregon. I know an old-timer who I trust who says he's seen a Sasquatch around Silver Falls, Oregon. I've got a couple buddies who swear they've seen one together up around Camp Merriweather. Oh, boy. Here goes nothing. So I'm from Central Florida. I've grown up in the Spring Hill/Hernando County area. I've always heard the usual stories about aliens and shit. In fact, one of the neighboring cities in the area, Brooksville, was known as the UFO capital of the world pre-Roswell. Our local craft brewery even has an IPA named after the event, John Reeves Incident. Now, I say this having been and kind of still being a skeptic, but for the life of me, I can't ducking figure out what me and my friends saw in the woods one night in our late teens. It was my junior year of high school, and my parents were out of town on a cruise. My buddies Eric and Mike swung over to my house with a 24-pack of Bud Light, and we started driving out to Weeki Wachee / the preserves off of Shoal Line Boulevard, a semi-desolate road that leads to Hernando Beach. It's super swampy, and there are brackish water creeks and channels all over. This particular area of Florida looks more like what you would imagine Louisiana looking like than something out of a Florida postcard picture. We make it to the nature preserve and start walking back to the spot known as Cliffs, which is essentially a large man-made lake from an old rock quarry that existed at the site years ago. Now I know I said there was a 24-pack involved in this, and Mike and Eric, along with the rest of the guys and girls that showed up, were plenty ducking sauced. However, I was always a goody two-shoes in high school, and I never drank, smoked, or did any drugs until I got to college. In fact, had my parents not been gone, I wouldn't have even been able to make it out there. Especially at 3 a.m. on a cold mid-December night. I was sober as a ducking judge. One of the guys has the spectacular idea of taking a hike, specifically jumping over a fence that is along the border of the nature preserve and venturing back into some really thick wooded area. We all followed. We must have walked about a mile back into this area when, all of a sudden, there looked to be glowing green mucus-looking shit all over the ground. The best way to explain it was that it looked like someone dumped gallons of glow sticks on the ground. For some reason, we all decided to keep going further. At least until everyone heard the distinct scream of what sounded like a woman. The whole group started darting back through the woods in this moment. Except me. I turned around after seeing them dart, and I saw these blinding white lights all parallel to the ground and about 8 feet off of it. It was extremely dark, so I didn't really get to see the structure that these were attached to. I turned and darted, eventually catching up to the pack, none of us stopping until we got into our cars and pulled off. It's been well over 10 years since this happened. To this day, we still talk about it when we get together. We've tried looking up different bioluminescent species that are native to this part of Florida, but to no avail. We even tried looking up crimes and missing persons in the area, but we never found anything that corresponded with the correct time frame. To this very day, we can't wrap our brains around what we saw and heard that night. If anyone has witnessed something similar, please reach out. This has been bugging me for quite some time. I've spent a lot of time out in the woods in Oregon. I would drive an ATV sometimes or just hike up there. I went several times a week for years and years, usually in Paulina National Forest, as I think it's called. I've seen a lot of strange things. I'll try to add the weirdest ones. Many of them were encounters with people behaving strangely, and a few with animals. I was up there sometime in the afternoon. I took an old fire road on my ATV. I'd been out for about an hour, so it gets kind of desolate up there if you start taking the logging trails and so on. I'd bring extra gas because of how far I'd go. I remember I was going probably about 15 miles per hour, and I had to hit the front and back brakes because I saw something crossing the road up ahead, and it's hard to stop on a loose rock. It was huge. At a distance, I thought it was a deer or something, but when I got close, it looked like a massive dog. I stopped, all the dust flew about me, and I was ducking stunned because it was the biggest black wolf I'd ever seen. At this time, they hadn't released the wolves into Oregon again, as far as I know, so I was just sitting there on my ATV frozen as this giant wolf sauntered across the road. It didn't seem to care about the noise I made or all the dust, and it didn't even move out of the road quickly. It was walking very slowly. But it finally stopped looking at me, and it had these incredible yellow eyes. We locked gazes, and it just creeped me the duck out. It stood there completely still, just staring. I wasn't sure what to do or if it was going to come toward me. It gave me zero shits that I was just sitting there, parked on my noisy, idling ATV. Then it turned away and disappeared into the brush. I still to this day think it wasn't a wolf, at least not a normal one. I know wolves are big. I had a 120-pound wolf dog, and he looked and acted nothing like this. This thing was wild and had these incredible eyes. It also had no concern for me in the slightest. I'm an average-sized woman, but just the same, wolves generally avoid people and will run off if they see you. Something about the way it was so silent has stuck with me. I've never seen anything like that since. It gives me chills just typing it out. About 20 years ago, southwest of Eerie, along a dirt road up in the mountains that my dad and his buddies used for hunting, they came across a random cement structure off to the side of the road. He said it was about a 10-foot by 10-foot platform, about a foot tall. On top, there was a heavy steel grate. They had been in that area before and had never seen it, so they stopped out of curiosity. They looked into the grate and couldn't see the bottom, so they used a flashlight. I still couldn't see anything. So they dropped a rock to see how far it went. Based on the time it took for the rock to hit the bottom, they estimated it was about 200 feet to the bottom. They dropped another one to confirm, but after it hit, they heard a low, long growl that turned into a screeching howl that he said was unlike anything he's ever heard. I've never known my dad to be afraid of anything, but he said it was the most frightening thing he'd ever experienced. He and his buddy ended the hunting trip and came home. They've never returned to the area, and he even refuses to tell me exactly where this is, as he's concerned I'll take a bunch of guys up there to look for it. I live in a fairly wooded area. There are lots of nature trails that lead way back into the middle of nowhere. One night, my buddy and I decided to go for a walk, smoke, and catch up a little. He was back from college for Christmas break, and we hadn't seen each other in months. This is something we did a lot in high school. We decided to try a trail we'd never been down before but had driven past many times over the years. It led about 2 miles into the woods and wrapped around a lake at the end. In hindsight, we should have brought flashlights, but we assumed our eyes would adjust along the way. When in doubt, our lighters will save us. We underestimated how pitch black and utterly dark it would be down there. We were at the far end of the lake, circling back around, making a lot of noise, and being stupid, when my buddy stopped dead in his tracks. I kept talking, thinking he was just lighting another cigarette. "Shut the duck up," he says. "Is that a person?" I looked to see where he was gestating. About 20 feet from us was a patch of trees, with something definitely moving back and forth between them. By that time, we'd been out there for over an hour, and we could make out some things in the dark. There's a moment of apprehension where your heart sinks into your chest, and you begin to fully take in your surroundings when you realize how vulnerable you really are. I don't think I've ever been as caught off guard and terrified as I was in that moment. It wasn't even a fight or flight moment. There was just something in my head that was picking up on the bad vibes in the air. There was no doubt it was a person by the time the silhouette moved. My buddy tapped my arm and said, "We're going to run." Then we turned and took off up the path, checking behind us every 5 seconds. We made it up to the road, got in his car, and drove away. Later, when talking about it back at the house, he confessed to the same feeling I had. He said he got the feeling that whatever it was wanted to hurt us. The moral of the story is to stay out of the woods after 2 a.m. So, about 4 to 5 years ago, my buddy called to say he shot a doe, but she ran into the woods and wanted an extra set of eyes to help track. I, of course, got my stuff together and headed over. By the time I got to the farm, where he was hunting, it was dark out, so we headed out across the field. While approaching the tree line, I noticed what appeared to be a porch light through the woods, so I asked him how far off the house was and what other houses were around. He assured me there were no houses or anything. I assumed he was confused, so I pointed the light out to him, and he was baffled. At this point, we were 200 yards from the tree line. And without anything to compare the light to, it was hard to gauge how far into the woods the light was, but it appeared to be 100 years in. So it's about then that we realize the light is moving towards us. But not like someone walking with a flashlight or headlamp. There was no sweeping, no up and down bobs, and it was about 8 feet off the ground. This is not easy terrain either. It had been logged years before, so the underbrush was extreme. Mix that in with the old skidder ruts and everything else. We immediately knew something was off about it. It moved smooth as butter and was completely silent through the woods. When the light eventually got to the field, it stopped for a moment and traveled to the left, from our perspective, for about 50 years, stopped, went up about 15 feet, then back down, then back up. I turned to my buddy and asked if we should get closer to it. I don't know why, I guess I'm a curious individual. Without missing a beat, the only thing he had to say was why? Right when he said that, it was as if the light focused in on us, like we had surprised it or something, and the entire area around us lit up with a dim light, almost as if it were a full moon but only directly over us. There was no moon in the sky this night. We were both officially freaked out and agreed it was time to get out of there and hightail it back across the field. We went back for the deer the next morning and spoke briefly about what we had seen, but were just as stumped as the night before. Several weeks went by, and I decided to tell my dad about it. He's friends with a guy who owns property neighboring the farm and thought it would interest him. Well, come to find out, a few days later, when my dad saw him, he told his friend what we had seen. He said the guy got very serious and told him he had had several encounters with this light in the past but never told anyone about it in fear of people thinking he was going crazy. I know it wasn't a human with a flashlight, I know it wasn't a drone, and I don't know of any animals that are capable of this. I do have a guess, though. After hours of research, I came across Native American folklore that spoke about orbs of light that protect and guide white-tailed deer. I always wonder if that is what we saw, and it was trying to show us where his deer was, so it didn't go to waste. I'd be interested to hear if anyone else has ever had an experience like this. I used to joy ride on back roads and drink a few beers, etc. One time, this gated Forest Service road was opened where it is normally locked. This road led 10 miles into a place called Ramsey's Draft, which is also near a place called the Confederate Breastworks, where they used to make and store ammo during the Civil War. Anyway, we drive down this road, and it eventually dead ends in a heavily wooded valley. There is a trailhead there into the draft, so we hop out of the truck and walk around to piss and drink a beer, etc. Immediately, me and my two buddies get a feeling something is off about this place. It felt like someone was watching us, so we did what any logical dumbasses would do, and we split up to look around. I was about 100 yards from the truck when I stumbled upon a campfire that had recently been smothered, like a few minutes ago. Next to the fire was a wooden stake in the ground, and resting on top of that stake was a ducking lit cigarette. I about SHT myself, to be honest. I pulled my pistol out and quickly, but not in a panicked way, made my way back to the truck, where I found my buddies with pistols drawn, whispering, "We need to get the duck out of here right now." And we did that, and I've never been back. Not long after this happened, a man went missing from the Confederate breastworks in Ramsey's Draft area. The story goes that he was confronted by some people while hiking and was told to never come back, but for some reason he went back the next day because he left his cell phone or something and was never seen again. His name was Robert Fitzgerald. I grew up in rural Appalachia, and I currently reside in Appalachia. I grew up wandering these hills. You can get lost for days if you don't take your bearings. Me and a couple buddies went out when we were around 15. It was summer, and we were going to go to this waterfall, which was about an 8-hour hike through the bare wilderness, one that we had made several times before. Well, as young, stupid, and overconfident as we were, we got lost. We tried to backtrack using the sun, but it was no use. We spent 2 nights out there before this event took place. On the 3rd night, we were woken to loud metal clicking. It continued getting closer over the next 30 minutes until we could see what appeared to be headlights traveling slowly through the woods, not directly at us but in our direction. As we were debating quietly whether or not to approach this vehicle, it just suddenly stopped a football field out, and the lights and engine went off. We sat around waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. We stayed awake until daylight, and there was nothing there. No road, no vehicle, no tracks, no explanation. Just more miles and miles of wood. We spent another night in the woods before we found a road and hitched a ride. I was on an extended canoe river trip with my friends when I was 15. It was in the middle of nowhere, in the southeastern US. Very swampy, with Spanish moss and alligators the whole 9 yards. The first night, we went out to a small island sandbar in the middle of a bend in the river and made a bonfire. The island was small enough just for our fire and for us to sit around. We were goofing off, making a bunch of noise, joking and laughing, and such, but when the fire died down, we were just sitting around it talking when we heard this freaky, high-pitched scream coming from a distance in the direction of the opposite bank. It was at least a mile or 2 away. It scared us, but we eventually forgot about it until one of my friends started freaking out and pointing to the opposite bank. I turned to look and saw what he was pointing at. It was a large, human-like silhouette standing behind a bush, just watching us. It was huge, and it appeared to be glowing, but I think that was just an effect of the full moon that night. We were all just frozen and stunned. We could see it from about waist up. It was crazy tall and had huge, broad shoulders. Eventually we got our wits about us, and we retreated back to our side of the river, and when we looked back, it was still there, just checking us out. I have a vivid memory of one of my friends standing next to me, audibly whimpering. We ran back to wake up my friend's dad. This was in the wee hours of the morning. We dragged him out of his tent and got our flashlights. It was still there when we got back. We all pointed our flashlights at it, but at that distance, it wasn't bright enough to illuminate it, but its eyes shone red when they caught the glare of our flashlights. We just stood there and watched it. Eventually it walked to our right, upstream along a high embankment, then it walked back, turned to look at us, and disappeared into the woods. The next morning, when we paddled out, we passed right by where it had been standing. In the daylight, I got a good look at the bush it was standing behind. The bush came about to its belly. I'm 6'2". Back then, I was maybe just shy of 6 feet. That bush would have come up to my chest, at least. That thing was big. Last summer, I was talking to my friend's dad, the guy we dragged out of his tent, and we started talking about this experience. He said that when we woke him up, he figured we had spooked ourselves and that he was just going to show us that there wasn't anything to be afraid of. He expressed his surprise to actually see that there was something out there. Now, over the years, I convinced myself that I had imagined certain details, like the size of it and the glowing eyes, but in our conversation, this guy said to me, "Do you remember how its eyes shone red when we hit it with our flashlights?" I got chills when he said that because we had never spoken about the eyes, and it manifested to me that we really did see something. My friends and I who were there, about 9 or so of us, almost never talk about it. The few times it has come up, it has been brief, but there are differing opinions about whether it was a ghost, Bigfoot, or something else. Usually when it does come up, it is referred to as that thing or the demon, but we haven't talked about it in a decade or so, except for the conversation I had with my friend's dad last summer. From 2012 to 2013, I did a lot of hiking in and around the coastal range in Oregon. I would frequently go out by myself for days and come into town to restock on food if necessary. It was common for me to spend the whole day hiking back the 4 hours to where I was camping at dusk. The trail I took wasn't well traveled and looked more like a deer path than anything. I had chosen my campsite for its lack of foot traffic and its serenity, avoiding conventional locations. I had only a cell phone on me during this period of hiking and camping, no bright clothing, and no GPS tracking device and/or emergency beacon. It probably wasn't the smartest idea, looking back. There were times I heard and saw things while out in the forest that I didn't recognize by sight and or sound, but nothing came close to the incident I had in May 2013. I had done my usual restocking in a small town some 6 miles from where I had decided to camp for the night, and I spent the day in town as usual. I started walking back to my camp location around dusk. For half of the walk, I chose to use dirt roads until veering off on the deer trail I used earlier in the day. By this time, it was completely dark, but it was clear out and possible to see the trail still using the moonlight. I don't listen to headphones while hiking. I have always thought it's wise to be able to hear what's around me in the event there's a predator, whether human, animal, or whatever. I was mentally doing some calculations for the next day's hike when my mind literally stopped mid-track. I hadn't heard anything, and I don't make hardly any sound when hiking. If I had heard something, I would have known. For some reason, be it a sixth sense or survival instinct, I'm not sure, I was jolted quite suddenly out of thought and very aware of the fact I wasn't alone on this trail. What was odd to me, especially, is that even though I had heard nothing whatsoever, light wind, no birds, I knew acutely that something was behind me, specifically about 30 yards down the trail. I still, to this day, have so many unanswered questions about how I knew this. Standing really still, I turn around and look down the trail. I don't see anything, but I feel it. It's honestly really difficult to pin down exactly how to describe what I felt because I hadn't felt that way before or since. It was straight up fight or flight, and my logical mind was saying there's nothing out of the ordinary while my senses were saying get the hell out of there. Again, looking back and remembering this, I have no idea what to say. This is really hard to write. It was like I was being taunted, and I felt it. The presence of something or someone was down that trail, and for some reason I knew that it was there even though I couldn't see it. That's what still scares me to this day. It knew. And it was bright enough out for me to see down the trail 30 yards back, no problem. There wasn't anything on that trail, and I will swear by it. It was like I was being taunted or beckoned to come closer. This was maybe 30 seconds into looking down the trail, if that. I was panicking, but I still wasn't sure what to think because I wasn't seeing anything threatening, so I turned around and started walking at a quick pace. I didn't know what else to do. I knew that if it was in fact a guy out to kill someone, he's probably going to end up killing me on this trail or in my tent after following me back to it. So why run was my logical thought. I would say it was not even a minute into the quick trek back that I heard what I can only describe as a sound like rushing or swooping air, followed by what seemed like a rake sliding across the dirt trail, the former sound happening right after the latter sound. These sounds happened together, half a second apart, 4 times. And they were very close to me. Maybe 20 yards back. Looking back, I don't know how I was able to stay composed and not soil myself, but somehow I mentally stayed focused on getting back to my tent, ignored the panic, and just kept walking quickly, not looking back. Whoever or whatever it was still followed me the majority of the next hour. I just kept heading forward and didn't look back. A few minutes from my camp location, the fight or flight feeling gradually but succinctly left, and I crawled into my tent and didn't sleep a minute that entire night. Morning came, I packed up, and I left. So, this happened to me about a year ago. I was working on my friend's property in Northern California. Full disclosure, it was a marijuana farm, which kind of feeds into the rest of the story, and I was sleeping in my pickup truck's covered bed each night, which was about a quarter-mile walk down the gravel drive each night. One night I turned in for sleep, and some time later I was awoken by the sound of something scratching up against the side of my truck. I had a bunch of dog or human food in the cab, so I figured it was some kind of animal trying to get at the food. I was laying there awake in bed for about 30 seconds, trying to decide if I should try to scare whatever creature it was off or just ignore it, when the scratching stopped abruptly, followed maybe 2 seconds later by a very pronounced rhythmic knocking on my windshield, as if someone were trying to wake me up. I immediately grabbed my mag light, which I had next to me, shoot up and shine the light out the window, and there's nothing there. It's dead quiet out, and I don't hear any sounds of anything running through the brush at all. As this is all happening, I notice that my dog is dead asleep, and this was the first thing that really concerned me. I take her out camping a lot, and she is always on alert to anything that comes around the vicinity, usually waking me up with warning growls. I had to shake her awake. What happens next is basically nothing, but this is also a bit odd to me now in hindsight. I fell asleep immediately and very calmly. I'm a bit of a high-strung person, and normally if I hear even a damn squirrel rummaging around camp at night, I'll be wide awake for a good while with a high heart rate, but this time I fall into a dead sleep. I do, however, remember the dream, which followed very well. It was a bit abstract, but I was in a place resembling my hometown, and I was aware of a group of 3 people hunting for me. I could see them, but they weren't able to see me. There wasn't much substance to the dream, but it left a very palpable feeling of dread and panic. I wake up the next day, only to find out first thing in the morning that a friend of the property owners who was in the local government had tipped him off to the fact that warrants had been served on the property, and we had about 48 hours to get whatever done that we could, basically removing as much pot from the property as possible as well as guns and cash, etc. I also discovered that my truck was completely dead and would not turn over at all after having been running great with no signs of any malfunction for months. So, long story short, we do what we can in the 48 hours allotted, and I get a friend I was working with to get me and the dog out of the area. We were about to vacate the property at around midnight, and I realized there were a few things that I had left in my truck, so I headed back down the drive to get them. I get about 20 feet away from the truck, and my dog sits down in the middle of the trail and won't come any closer. I call out to her and try to cajole her along, but she won't budge. I head closer to the truck, and right when I get within about a foot of the door, the truck starts violently shaking back and forth in place. I've got the light trained on it, the windows are all up, there's nothing inside running around the cab, it's just shaking violently on its own. I turn tail and leave, figuring I'll get a new passport one of these days. We leave the property, and as we're driving out of Northern California, I'm telling this story to my friend. I think I was probably a bit incoherent and crazy sounding at the time, because it really ducked with my head when it happened. He was camped on a ridge overlooking my truck, and he says to me that on that same night he had been awoken at a late hour as well and had gotten out of the tent to take a piss. It was pretty bright with moon and starlight out there, but he says that when he looked down at the ridge towards my truck, he couldn't see anything. The whole area had no light penetrating it, as if some kind of shade blocked out everything around the trail. There was one more important part I forgot to mention in this story, and this was the thing that really made me lose it. The day before this happened, I had gotten a message from my friend back home, whom I hadn't talked to in a few years, out of the blue. It basically reads something like, "Hey man, this is kind of weird, but I had a really ducked up dream about you last night, and it was bad enough that I felt like I had to check in on you." I replied to him, saying I was all good. The next morning, after the weird knocks and dreams, I get back on the internet and find a message from my uncle, who I also haven't really been in steady contact with, saying, almost word for word, the exact same thing. This part really freaked me out. Anyway, it's been about a year and nothing else has come of it. The truck's still up on that mountain, too far and undeveloped to get towed. I had one other really crazy occurrence recently while camping in the woods in Kentucky, but I don't think they're related, and this one just made much more of an impression on me. Any thoughts? The point of this story is to illustrate how quickly a hike can turn into a potentially life-threatening scenario that takes you off the trail. Back during COVID, a friend of mine who was an experienced backpacker invited me to go on a 3-day hike with him in Bankhead National Forest, Alabama. I had never really hiked before, and I had no equipment. He told me exactly what I needed, and we went to REI to buy equipment. I bought about $600 worth of stuff, including a backpack, camel pack, hammock, tarp, emergency equipment, rations, etc. Before we left, we weighed our packs, and we both had about 40 pounds of gear, which he said was a little on the heavier side but safer. We printed out maps of the forest that included trails and streams. We planned a 22-mile hike over 3 days, giving us time to fish because we were really into fishing at the time. The first day went by fine. It was 98 degrees and humid, typical for summer in Alabama. He told me to take a sip from my camel pack every 2 minutes, and he really drilled it into me, so I followed that rule religiously. We hiked 7.5 miles and set up for the night. We saw a deer swimming down the river, which was neat. But the second day, things went wrong. It started fine. We fished a bit in the morning and saw a 4-foot long nose gar, which was cool. Then we went hiking further. It was still almost 100 degrees, and by noon we were running low on water, so we looked at the map and planned to get more at the next stream. However, the next stream dried up. Over the course of the afternoon, we carried on from stream to stream, only to find them all dried up. We got desperate and checked the map for off-trail streams and went about half a mile off-trail to find one that seemed promising, but it was mostly mud. We were so desperate for water that we attempted to pump it from the muddy water with our filter, but it ended up clogging our filter. We were in a really bad spot, half a mile off-trail, 5 miles from the last water source, and it was already almost evening. We abandoned the original hike plan and made a mad dash back to the last known water location. By the time we got there, it was almost dark. I was feeling a bit exhausted, but otherwise fine. However, my friend, who was the experienced one, started vomiting and trembling uncontrollably. He couldn't drink water without immediately throwing it up, and he couldn't stand or really even move without his muscles contracting, which he described as the most painful thing he ever felt. I set up both our hammocks, picked him up, and placed him in his. We had no cell reception, it was dark, and we still had 6 miles to go to get back. The next day he was a little better, but it took a very long time to make the hike back as he was constantly stopping to rest or throw up. This shows that even if you are experienced, your situation can go from routine to literally dying and unable to function in less than a day. If I wasn't with him, he might have died, perhaps off the trail, deliriously searching for water. I am sure many of these cases involve someone suffering from dehydration, hypoglycemia, or low electrolytes, driving them to go off trail in confusion and die. In May of 2003, I was fresh out of high school and had just joined the Marines. There was a period from when I joined until I could go to boot. So I took those few weeks to sign up for a survival camp. A local company in Gatlinburg offered survival techniques over a 10-day period. We met at the Elkmont Campground in the Great Smoky Mountains with a group of 5 other survivalists, a group leader, and his assistant. They would stay with us for 3 days and show us techniques. Things like setting up tents, identifying local flora and fauna that were edible, how to set traps, etc. For 3 days, our group did several things. After the 3 days, we were let go on our own. You would stay at base camp, and the leader would walk you several miles into the undergrowth. Each of us was taken at different times and given a satellite radio in case we had an emergency. So we set off on our own and made the best of it. The group leaders would stay at base and wait 5 days, then come get you. Day 1, the first night is quiet, I only hear a few things out in the forest. It's very dark outside the firelight, and I've collected enough wood to keep any critters at bay. Especially black bears, as they can be curious. I was awoken at some point in the night by the phone. Another survivalist is complaining about some large animals walking around his campground. It seems like it's a bear, but it sounds like it's walking on 2 legs. Never says anything else the rest of the night. The night goes by without incident. I will say I did find tracks that looked human but were indicative of a Bigfoot, as the footprint wasn't quite like ours. I wear a size 12 boot. I put my foot into the print, and it was a solid 5 longer. Now there are stories of the TN wildman in this part of the country, and several of the stories originated in Coke County, which is just to the north of Sevier and Jefferson on the other side of the GSM. My grandfather owns a small cabin in Newport and has told me stories about him hunting and something following him. I brushed the stories off until I saw that print, and then the night 1 sat call. Night 3 is when everything went to shit around 1 a.m. I started questioning things when a large rock hit the back of my lean-to. I figured it was from the boulder, and something simply broke off, as rock slides are common around here. After that woke me up, I grabbed the flashlight and assessed the damage. I rolled the boulder off the shelter, and it wasn't too far from breaking it completely. I half fixed it and figured I would just fix it in the morning. I had caught a rabbit in a snare, and I cleaned it not far from camp. I'd say 100 yards. I could hear noises from that area. But I chalked it up to raccoons or a fox. I shined the light that way but saw nothing as the trees were too thick. Then something screamed. It sounded like a gorilla when it got angry, followed by a chuffing sound, like when a dog has drunk too much water. That deep in the throat feels like it's clearing it out. I stood there frozen in this tiny clearing, thinking a bear was finishing off the entrails of the rabbit I cleaned earlier. I have no weapons other than my hatchet and a pocket knife. I come out of my trance and walk over to my backpack, never taking my eyes off the wood line. Everything at night is quiet. I only hear the river running and the logs crackling. I sit down with my hatchet and throw more logs on the fire. I'm hoping that it gets large enough and hits enough to keep things at bay. I sit for maybe 30 minutes, and I'm kind of dozing off, then another rock comes hurling from the left side of the forest and falls 10 yards away. I know the boulder didn't do this based on where this rock came from. Now I'm panicking. I stand up, hoping to make myself look large with my shadow on the boulder behind me. I hear the chuffing again, and the smaller trees further in are clearly moving back and forth rather quickly. I can see a large black shape moving around the firelight, just at the edge of the end of the light. 40 yards, maybe. I can hear this thing breaking limbs and crushing leaves with every step. The thing was at least 8 feet tall, if I had to guess. But it was pretty far away from where I was. It's slowly moving away, but I could tell where the head was watching me, as every now and again I'd see my eyes shine. The sound started getting fainter and fainter. And I could hear it go into the river and cross it. That loud shush sound from the water as it crossed was only a few steps. It was about 20 feet across the river at this point. I went back down and contemplated what to do. It's around 2 a.m., and I have a few hours until daylight. I don't want to walk the 4 miles back to Elkmont in the dark in a place I'm not familiar with. Fast forward 2 hours, it's 4-ish a.m. The phone turns on, and a guy is screaming into it, "Something is trying to kill me. I've had several rickshaws thrown at me. A large man is outside my shelter. I can hear it, this isn't a bear, I don't know what it is. But I need help." Silence. 15 minutes and 20 minutes go by, and another guy comes on. "Something did that to me last night, but I thought it was a bear. I stayed here, thinking I knew what it was. Rocks weren't thrown, though, but I could hear them walking the perimeter of my camp." The guides must have awoken at this point, as the lead got on and said they could call the park service to come get everyone. But that would be hours, and it's better to stay put and make do. So I wait. It's close to 5 a.m. now. If I can make it a few hours until daylight, I'm fine. All the forest sounds have returned. I'm still waiting, and around 7:15 a.m., I can see flashlights in the distance. The sun isn't quite up yet, but that eerie dawn light is filling the land. The clearing is still pretty dark. I start gathering my things and start putting the fire out with dirt around the pit. And by the time it's out, the rangers will be there with me. One of them was older and clearly of native Indian descent. He said there are stories of men in these woods who don't take to people living on their land. That tribe has always sought harmony with each other. I tried to ask more, but he said we do not talk about these men. We walked back to Elkmont, where we met the rest of the group. One guy was clearly shaken up, and I assumed he was the one yelling on the phone. He only said its teeth were like apes. He can't get those teeth out of his head. I still go to the GSM often, as my parents live there. I still hike and camp, but I never go alone. Even as a former Marine and seeing some terrible things, I have never felt that primal fear as I did that night 17 years ago. That's my story of the time I did a survival camp, which only lasted 3 days. If you ever venture out to Cades Cove, Tremont, or any of the many hiking trails, be wary that something may be watching you. My grandmother owns some land in the Black Hills of South Dakota. She goes out for a month or so in July. She lives in Ohio, so I go out for a week in the summer to visit her. It's the only time I get to see her every year, and this year I brought my girlfriend along. My parents, as well as my aunt and uncle, came as well, but they stayed in a hotel in Deadwood. Her land is back in the woods, which is pretty good. It's several miles from Highway 385. The Black Hills don't have any bears, but it is mountain lion country, and several have been spotted in the area, so my grandma keeps pepper spray and A.44 under her cot. She sleeps in a little shed that she can lock from the inside and out. My girlfriend and I, however, were tent camping. At night, my family would leave for the hotel, and it would just be my grandmother, my girlfriend, and me. It was very common for deer to roam by our tent, and it happened most mornings. Late at night, I would also hear them padding around outside and snorting occasionally. One night, the wind was much stronger than normal, and we could hear the trees swaying a lot. We had made our tent at the base of a dead tree, which unnerved my girlfriend and me a bit, so we decided to move to my car, which was maybe 20 to 40 feet from the tent. We got to the car and fell back asleep. Sometime later, could have been 20 minutes, could have been 4 hours, I have no sense of time, I randomly woke up. I looked out the windshield of my car, and between the car and the tent, I could see the outline of what I could only assume was a lion. It was feline, for sure, and much larger than a domestic cat. I am 100% positive that it wasn't a deer. It had a fluid movement to it, not the jerky, hesitant movement of a deer when walking around. It really did look like it was prowling. I only saw it for a few moments before it prowled away, and I couldn't see it anymore. It seemed to vanish into the darkness. It could have been my imagination, as I had just woken up, but my instincts tell me it wasn't. Imagination or not, it was super creepy, and it makes me think what I heard the previous night might not have been deer. After my sophomore year of high school, I worked as a camp counselor at a local Boy Scout camp. The camp was very old and had a lot of large areas of just woods and wilderness. There was also a section of the camp that was shut down about 30 years before I worked there but contained a lot of spooky stuff, like the so-named haunted house and haunted woods. There was also a lodge named for some American pilot who had been captured and ended by the Japanese in World War II, and in this lodge, which was a few miles away from the rest of the camp, there was a creepy as duck photo of him hanging on the walls. It felt like his eyes were boring you. Anyway, to get back on track, myself and another counselor who was 16 were taking a group of maybe 4 adults and 15 kids into the woods for a wilderness survival overnight where the kids had to build primitive shelters. The area we were going to was in another unused section of camp and was about 1.5 miles away from any other populated areas. We headed out maybe an hour before dusk and reached the site. As we were walking in, we heard what sounded like a shrill whistling, like someone blowing very hard on one of those cheap plastic whistles, that went on for maybe 10 seconds and repeated itself every 30 minutes or so. We didn't think too much of it because there was another group going out on a trip that night, and they were staying maybe half a mile south of us across a wide creek, so we thought it was them. The whistling continued as we were building the shelters and bunking down for the night. So at about 10:30, the other counselor and I walked to a nearby road where we met some of our buddies who had run out to town to get us some snacks. On the way to this road, we heard the whistling again, but it seemed to be coming from a different direction than where the other group was camping. It still seems like it was coming from across the creek, just much farther down the bank. It also surprised me because the group across the creek was composed of young kids and their parents, and I would have thought that they'd be sleeping by that time. Our group was asleep. We didn't hear any whistling after that one, for a while anyway. My buddy and I come back to our campsite and go to sleep. Next thing I know, it's the dead of night, like 2 a.m., one of those times when nothing seems alive and the night just feels malicious. I'm usually a very sound sleeper, but for some reason I wake up. I'm sitting there trying to fall back asleep when, all of a sudden, I hear the whistling again. This time, it sounds much closer and stronger, and it is coming from our side of the creek. It sounded like it was very close by. Obviously, I'm scared shitless at this point. Surprisingly, I did fall back asleep. I still get a little bit nervous thinking about the experience because I have no explanation for it. It wasn't a train, no trains were close by, and it didn't sound like a train whistle, and I can't reason why it would have been moving, especially through thick forest and across a substantially deep creek, maybe 5 feet, if it was just some random person from the other group. Also, I was completely sober and wasn't high or tripping. I hope that was interesting enough. There were also other weird things that happened to me that summer at camp, but they're not quite as strange. I spent a lot of my childhood in the woodland forest, both behind and to the left of my grandparents' house. I wouldn't always go into them alone. In fact, more often than not, I had my younger cousin, Ben, with me on my misadventures. One in particular really stands out to me. So my cousin and I would most of the time just wander around the first mile of the forest and look for ponds, animal bones, weird fungi, and normal young boy stuff. Well, one year in school, I got a backpack with a little built-in compass on the top. It only really worked if you set it flat on the ground, but hey, it was still a working compass, and that meant we could go even further into the woods without fear of getting lost. So one day Ben and I met in the middle of the levee and started our journey. We got about 3 or 4 miles in when we happened upon a clearing, which isn't necessarily uncommon, but this one was. The first thing we noticed was that it was a nearly perfect rectangle, save for one corner that was kind of dented in from the trees, and about the size of half a football field. The next thing we noticed was the grass. It was completely different there, like that thick, super dark green grass you see on rich people's lawns, not the thin scraggly stuff that grew everywhere else or even the kind some people purposely grew to attract deer to hunt. I asked my cousin if he knew anybody who lived out this far, thinking it might have been someone's hunting ground, backyard, or something. He wasn't sure, so we walked the entire perimeter to try and find a trail or back road. There was nothing like that, just the same thorns and bushes as where we stumbled. It was like the whole field was just dropped there. If you've been in the woods long enough, you know that a patch of grass that is both longer and brighter than the rest is usually the result of a lot of shit or a dead carcass. Well, in the near center of the field, there was indeed a patch of grass that was both longer and brighter. We investigated and found it was the latter, at least what was left of it. A long spine with no ribs or skull sat in the middle of the patch. My guess is it was a cow or horse, seeing as both are prevalent in the farmlands. The odd thing about it was that the spine was completely straight, no curve, no slouch, just flat and straight. We decided we were more creeped out than curious at that point and wanted to head home. I knew which direction we came from, but I was excited to use the compass, so I set it on the ground. 3 things struck me almost simultaneously. First, the spine was pointing in the exact direction we came from. Secondly, I couldn't hear a single bird, squirrel, or insect. The third was that my compass had a crack down the middle. I don't know if you have seen the backpack I'm talking about, but the glass part on the compass is so thick that it would have taken a hammer and determination to crack it, much more than just a simple walk through the woods. Being the big brave cousin I was, I decided not to mention it to Ben, seeing as how he was already a bedwetter. I slung on my backpack with confidence and headed toward home. In the next few years, we decided on several occasions to make the journey back out there. The only problem is that we never found it again. We met at the same place every time, headed in the same direction, and walked what we always felt was more than the same distance. We never found the clearing again. I'd love to hear about any of your experiences with the same happening to you. In the summer of 2015, I decided to hike to a spot called Dismal Falls in Transylvania County, North Carolina. Known as the land of waterfalls, the county is just running wild with creeks and tributaries. Very beautiful, but it's always had a mysterious feel. I've always felt a mysterious sense of curiosity while visiting the area. Dismal Creek was different, though. A man by the name of Jim Bob Tinsley wrote a book called Land of Waterfalls about southwestern NC and described Dismal Creek as the most foreboding place in the southern Appalachians. Keep in mind that I only learned this after my visit, and had I known of Tinsley's apprehension, I likely would have never visited. The hike itself is ridiculously demanding. Grades of over 50% make up the majority of the hike, and that's not an exaggeration. There are 4 waterfalls on the way up to the creek. The first 2 feel very sublime. Safe, but there's something channeling through. About the time you hit the third falls, called Grotto, the feeling of dread starts to become very prominent, but a sense of beckoning drew me onward. It is a very difficult feeling to describe. I got to a split in the path, and because the area is so unforgiving, my map was inconclusive. I could hear the falls down the mountainside, but I felt I needed to go up and over via the right path. I left a car for myself to determine the way back and headed up to the rugged jumble of earth that was the ridge line. I had just started the intense scramble when I got the sense that I was being watched. I turned to look behind me and thought I saw someone disappear into the rhododendron and mountain laurel surrounding the trail. I only saw the back of what appeared to be a cloak. There was no sound. It didn't make sense. The leaf litter gives away even the smallest insects. I should have heard something. I attributed this to a combo of dehydration and sheer exhaustion. I've seen shadow people in the woods before due to that, so I really didn't put much stock into it. I couldn't shake that feeling of dread, though. I continued the climb, step after grueling step, and after cresting over the ridge, I was in Dismal Holler. I found myself looking down at a nearly 70-degree angle with a rope anchored to a tree. I semi-riveted down to a second rope and finally to the bottom. Then came a wet rock scramble to the base of the falls. The falls were breathtaking. A 200-foot gentle cascade with a 40-foot sheer drop at the top. Incredible. I sat down to chew on some mountain mint, and when I glanced at the top of the falls, I nearly fell off the log and into the creek. There was a woman up there. She was pretty far away but appeared to be old and wearing a cloak of some sort. Gray, tightly curled hair. That's all I could see from my vantage point. She was facing me for a few seconds before turning and walking off out of view. I immediately got up and started scrambling up the mossy, soaked rock cascade toward the top of the falls. I got there after a very treacherous scramble, only to find nothing. Hands on my knees and taking labored breaths, I heard a voice from the bottom of the falls. "Hey!" It was said in a strange, spectral voice. It sounded hollow. I turned to look, and there she was, disappearing into the rhododendron once again. I was in total and absolute disbelief. I felt sick to my stomach. I carefully picked my way down to the base again and started the trail. I just felt I shouldn't be there. I've seen something I shouldn't have. I'm a longtime bushman, and I'm not afraid to say that I'm tough as ducking nails, but I wanted to run out of that holler crying. I finally made it to the top, using the ropes for help. As soon as I crested the ridge, my nose started bleeding. Only a few drops. I kept moving and was essentially running along the mountainside. I got to the bottom and followed the path indicated by Karin. I kept running and came around a blind curve. I nearly ran into her at full speed. In trying to stop, I took a hard tumble, and when I opened my eyes, she was standing over me. She looked very Scottish. Curly hair and fair skin. She didn't look particularly gruesome or hag-like. She was very old, but it was obvious that in her youth she had been beautiful. Her eyes, though. The eyes were very alive and full of vitality. Very youthful, and the irises were so light blue they were almost white. Though her form appeared benign, I had the distinct feeling that she did not mean me well and that she didn't want me there. I wanted to crawl away from where I had fallen, but I was backed up against a rock. I edged along it until I regained my feet and backed away from her. Her expressionless gaze never left me. I ran until I was well off that mountain. When I stopped running, I was on a more well-established trail. When I had come in, the area felt fine, but now I could feel the dread still. All was silent as I hiked out. Not a single animal sound. I was almost out when suddenly a bobcat appeared on the trail ahead of me, seemingly from nowhere. I stopped and looked at it as it looked at me. It had her eyes. I knew they were her eyes. I told her I wouldn't be back and told her that her mountain was beautiful. Then I left as she disappeared into the rhododendron thicket. When I was 8-ish, I went with my friend to visit her grandparents, who owned a very small airport in Washington. Her brothers and my brother also went. One day, we all decided to go wandering through the woods. The brothers all decided to abandon us, so we kept walking. We stopped at an old truck that had hit a tree. There were no windows, and the tree was starting to grow around it. She told me that her uncle had died at a young age when he crashed that truck and wasn't discovered for over 12 hours. I thought she was screwing with me, but we started hearing weird noises. Assuming it was our brothers screwing with us, we walked out of the woods, crossed a little stream, and ended up on the airfield. But we saw all 3 boys running up the hill, about 1/4 mile away, toward the house. So we, not wanting to be around them, turned back into the woods, crossed the stream, and took maybe 10 steps back into the woods. Suddenly, we hear a loud stomping of something running, and a black blur runs right past us. The thing was probably 8 feet tall and was going so fast it was literally a blur. My friend and I screamed and booked it out of the woods and back to the house as quickly as possible. When we got there, we told her oldest brother, who was the only adult, not the ones from earlier, what happened. He assumed it was a bear or mountain lion and loaded up a shotgun to scare it away from the runway. He said that he saw a huge trail where something ran through, but it was long gone. All the guys told us we probably saw a mountain lion running, but to this day, it still gives both of us chills thinking about it because we both know what we saw. This was while I was on a canoe trip with my dad in Algonquin Park, a huge swath of lakes, marshes, and white pine forests only accessible by canoe, just a few hours north of Toronto. After 4 hours of paddling and portaging, we get to a pretty ramshackle backcountry cabin that we booked for my dad's back. I guess he thought it would be better than a tent. The cabin is located in a mosquito and blackfly-infested marsh, which is pretty common for the area. Our first day there was pretty good, other than seeing a snake in the cabin and finding a creepy journal with some weird notes that others left from their stays there. We had some fresh-caught bass and pike, which I wouldn't recommend unless you're desperate, for dinner. The next day, we want to get a break from the bugs and paddle to a beach on the other side of the lake. We come back late in the afternoon to make dinner and notice a few things that freak us out. The hatchet we were using to chop firewood in the morning was gone. The cabin had been entered, and it was trashed. Our big water container was slashed open. There was also a trail of parted grass going through the marsh into the woods. Yet, the whole day, we were on the same lake and didn't notice anyone else canoeing around that could have done it. So whoever did it must have come from the woods by our cabin, and no animal could have opened the door. So we nope the duck out of there, pack up everything under 40 minutes, and send it back to the car. Unfortunately, we left at like 7 p.m. and had to spend a good hour or more paddling in the dark or at night to find our way back. Which is a terrible idea, BTW. We spent most of the time scanning the shore for landmarks to guide our way back. We eventually made it back an hour and a half faster than the trip out, but this was probably because we just sent some of the minor rapids instead of taking the time to portage. It was definitely a memorable experience. The car drive after was also crazy because we spent 15 minutes following a moose who wouldn't get out of our way on a tiny dirt road and managed to hit a deer while driving back to town on the highway. Me and my dad were definitely pretty shaken after that night. About 12 years ago, my boyfriend, ex, and I decided to go camping. I had always loved to camp, so I was really excited about it. We arrived well before dark and set up our tent about 2 miles into the park. We were fairly isolated, and there weren't a lot of people camping as it was a weekday. Did you do all of the typical stuff like eat, walk around, etc.? Once it started to get dark, we made a fire and sat there talking while my boyfriend drank whiskey. There were a few times I felt as if someone was watching me, but I didn't see or hear anything. I felt uncomfortable and couldn't figure out why. We eventually decided to get in the tent to get some sleep, and my boyfriend quickly passed out due to a large amount of whiskey. I, however, couldn't sleep. I still felt uncomfortable and as if I were being watched. I was lying on my side, facing the door of the tent, when suddenly, a very intense feeling of dread and fear hit me. It was the strongest feeling of fear I'd ever had in my life. Every hair on my body stood on end. There was a small window near the top of the tent, and it felt like if I looked at that window, something very bad would happen. It felt like I would die. I lay there completely still, trying to listen for any kind of noise. At that point, I realized there wasn't any noise at all. The crickets that had been chirping constantly were now dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop at that moment. I remained as still as possible for what felt like an eternity. I was absolutely terrified and convinced I was about to be killed. The feelings of fear and dread continued to get worse. I very quietly started trying to wake my boyfriend, but he was out cold. I decided I had to get to somewhere safer than the tent. I slowly crawled over and got the car keys from my boyfriend's pocket. I tried again to wake him up, but nothing. It felt as if my life depended on me getting out of that tent. I quickly unzipped the door and made a run for the car. As soon as I left the tent, it felt like someone was right behind me, but I didn't look back. I jumped into the car, locked the doors, and started bawling my eyes out while looking around. There was absolutely nothing there, but it was still dead silent, and I still felt as if I was going to die. I was so terrified that I stayed in the car with the doors locked all night, bawling my eyes out. The feeling of fear and dread started going away about an hour before sunrise, and sound came back, but no way was I getting out of that car. When my boyfriend finally woke up, I told him everything that happened, and he said, "It was just my imagination." That was the end of our relationship. I haven't been camping since this happened, and I'm not sure if I ever will again. This was about 4 or 5 years ago. Back then, I lived with my mother in a shed on a farm surrounded by woodland. Our farmland was part of a larger piece of farmland that was split up and sold off, so we did have neighbors, though they were roughly half a kilometer away each. We loved that because of the privacy. It wasn't like there was nobody nearby I couldn't go to if I needed help. That thought is what had me fearlessly walking alone at night between the hours of 7 to 8 p.m., sometimes fluctuating from earlier to later depending on the day. Sometimes I even went out on a walk at 2 a.m. because I was restless and couldn't sleep. Looking back, this was incredibly stupid, and after this incident, I never walked after 6 p.m. ever again, always making sure there was at least some sunlight left when I set out. The route I always took was a road circuit. The first part was out in the open in front of all the other farms, including my own. If anything had happened, at least one person would have noticed, and reception was pretty good, so I would have also been able to call someone. The second half, on the other hand, was concealed by about 200 meters of woods between the farms and the back road, stretching the full 2 kilometers at the back of the farm, and it was during that part of the walk that I had this creepy encounter. It was late at night, I can't remember what time exactly, but it was pitch black with the exception of my torchlight. I was about to approach the turn in the loop that would bring me out into the open again when I heard it. Help. It was this monotone voice that repeatedly asked for help. It didn't seem panicked in the least. I took my headphones out and turned my music off to make sure I was hearing correctly, but it didn't stop. Help. Help. A very stupid part of me almost responded, because for some reason my first instinct was, oh no, someone's in trouble, like a naive kid, even though I would have been like 16 or 17 at the time. Of course, then my brain kicked in, and I realized that approaching that voice was just about the stupidest thing I could do, so I started quietly backing away. Unfortunately, my cat had followed me on the walk and wasn't backing away from me. No, she was walking towards the voice, softly hissing. I remember desperately trying to get her to come back towards me without alerting the voice to my presence just in case they hadn't noticed me yet, but I was getting scared and didn't want to stay there a moment more, so I ran forward and grabbed her, then turned around and bolted back towards my house. I don't know if it was stupid of me to turn my back to the voice, as I was making so much noise while running that there was no way they didn't know I was there, and I had no way of knowing if they were giving chase. I was so ducking terrified that the whole time, the image of someone cloaked in shadows chasing me entered my mind, and even though I couldn't hear anyone behind me, I never once slowed down until I was back safe and sound within my house. It doesn't end there, though. Despite how terrifying it was, there was still a part of me that was concerned about whoever it was. Because what if they really needed help? So I asked my mother to drive us to the location, another very stupid decision considering what we found, which was nothing. We called out, but nobody answered. We didn't get out of our car, though, luckily, neither of us were that stupid. We drove home, having seen nothing and no one. But it still bothered me in the morning, so I had my mother drive us over again, and we searched the immediate area. Nothing, no indication that anyone had been there, there was no body, which admittedly was a drastic thing to search for, but I know shock can leave you eerily calm, which could have explained the monotone voice, and the lack of response afterwards made me fear that we'd been too late and we'd find a body in the morning. I don't know if I would have preferred this outcome, because at least then I would have had a face to the voice. But no, we found absolutely nothing, and to this day, I have no idea who that voice belonged to or why they were monotonously calling out for help. My mind has naturally come to some chilling conclusions and theories that leave me unable to sleep: kidnapper, killer, all the classic horror stories, but I guess I'll never really know for sure. I used to work at a Boy Scout summer camp. Every week I had to take a big group of campers to a secluded spot for their wilderness survival badge, where they had to build a shelter out of sticks, leaves, etc. and sleep in it overnight. The spot was only about half-mile from the main camp, but we took them a circuitous route that made it seem really secluded. Anyway, on this one night in 2004, all the campers had made their shelters, we had cooked dinner, and we were all just sitting around the campfire. It was getting late, maybe 11 o'clock, so I sent all the campers to their shelters for the night and started cleaning up the fire. That's when we heard, in the distance, what sounded like church bells. They were pretty faint, but myself and my fellow staffers could definitely hear them. They went on for about 30 minutes, ringing every 30 seconds or so. We were all a little creeped out, as there were no churches or towns within 20 miles of us. After the bells stopped, though, the singing started. It was too faint to hear the words, but it sounded like church choir music, but with a lot of people and a lot more enthusiasm. Also, it was almost midnight at this point. The singing went on for well over an hour, sometimes quieting down until we almost couldn't hear it, sometimes getting so loud we thought it was getting closer. All of the campers were super creeped out, but I lied to them, telling them there was a church service going on in camp and that there was nothing to be scared of. Eventually, at almost 1 a.m., the singing stopped. I found out a few days later that there had been a large KKK rally only a few miles away that night, and that's what we had heard. This happened while I was hiking the Appalachian Trail in 2013. Two of my friends and I met an off-putting, middle-aged guy somewhere between Boiling Springs and Duncannon, in Pennsylvania. I didn't think too much of him at first, except that he seemed a little strange and socially awkward, until he started talking about some local murders. Apparently, a man and woman had been murdered at one of the trail shelters nearby a few years before. He was excited at the prospect of camping at this shelter and was eager to tell us specific details about the murders. We were obviously creeped out and hiked away from him. A German couple was camping at the shelter we stopped at a few hours later, and we asked them if they had met the creepy guy who likes to talk about the local murders. They hadn't, but it wasn't long before he showed up, introduced himself, and quickly turned the conversation to the murders. I think that everyone was uneasy, but I guess we felt there was safety in numbers and that the three of us could team up with the Germans if any murdering started happening. We all camped there, though my two friends and I stayed up for most of the night in one of their huge tents, where we were smoking weed and whispering about what we would do if he rushed the tent or something. Then a headlamp shined on the tent. We all went silent and pulled out our pocket knives, as discussed. We just stared at each other, wide-eyed, until the light went off. I slept pretty uneasily that night, and we hiked all day long to get into town and away from this guy the next day. I never saw him again, but he wasn't the only weirdo I met on the or even on the Pennsylvania section of it. Truly bizarre accounts of forest demons. February 18, 2020. The forests of our planet have always attracted stories of the weird and wild. Ghosts, hauntings, mysterious vanishings, UFOs, and all manner of high strangeness call these secluded places home, and it is sometimes not hard to see why. The twisted branches, the feeling of isolation, the sense that we are not where we belong, all of these can contribute to woodlands being considered places ripe for tales of the weird. It might as well add demons to the list of strangeness in the wilderness, because according to some reports out there, something is stalking the wilds, and it is not always something that can easily be put into any category. Here we will look at some truly weird tales of something very evil, malicious, and quite possibly demonic stalking the wilderness, which prove that the forest can be even darker than we imagined. One very odd report appeared from a witness named Jennifer Gusnell. She describes how, when she was 15 years old, her family lived on a rural property bordering a cornfield and a forest, and that it was not uncommon at all to see deer wandering around. Indeed, on this day, she says she had wandered out into the surrounding wilderness to see if she could see a buck, as she and her brother had a sort of competition over who could spot a buck with the most antler points. She noticed as she walked along that the area was unusually devoid of wildlife on that day. There was nothing stirring, and she did not see any deer or even a rabbit. The whole forest was oddly still and silent, as if stuck in time. She decided to head back through a cornfield, and this is when she says she saw a hulking, black thing standing near the tree line, seeming to just stare at her. She at first took it to be maybe a hunter, and she also had the weird idea pop into her head that it might be a man in a gorilla suit. Yet as she looked more closely, a certain dread crept up on her when she realized that this was no man. She explains the series of strange events that would then unfold before her eyes. I was about 50 feet away from the tree line where it was, but it was staying so still now that I began to squint and look really hard to see what he was doing. Then, as the sun shone down, I saw the dark red hair all over it and the face with its black, empty-looking eyes staring back at me, and I suddenly realized this was no hunter in a moss suit. This was some type of animal/man thingy, and I was alone in a cornfield about 3/4 of a mile from my home with this thing. I picked up a clump of mud, tossed it towards the creature without thinking, and yelled at it to go. That's when this thing moved for the first time as the clump of mud landed feet in front of it, and it stood up, looking very menacing. I realized it had been squatting down all this time, and it was scary how tall it was. My heart was beating so hard, and I knew I'd never outrun it if I ran as fast as I could, but I had no options. It let out a horrible scream just then that rumbled in my chest like bass from a speaker, and it turned and began to recede into the forest, screaming the entire time. I don't know why, but I quietly followed to the edge of the woods to try and get a better look as it walked away, and by the time I reached the entrance, it had already made it back up the deep incline and was well on the other side. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It must have known I was watching because it stopped, turned its upper body, and looked me in the eye for a moment. Its face was a gray color, and its eyes were large and black, but the nose was almost pig-like, and the evil-looking grin was so knowing and intelligent. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Then I heard a strong voice say, "Don't follow me," but the creature's mouth didn't move at all. Shocked by everything, I turned and ran as fast as I could, losing my shoe in the mud by never stopping till I was inside my house. I ran to my mom and began telling her to call the police because I had just seen an ape man, as I called it. This might seem as though it was all a particularly odd Bigfoot sighting, but according to the witness's grandmother, what she had seen was what they called a forest demon, which was a sort of supernatural and very aggressive force that she claimed had lurked in the woods there for a long time. The witness explains this. Years before, there was a large log cabin on that property where she, the grandmother, lived while growing up. They were all hunters back then, so she was very familiar with the woods around the area, and she said they all knew where they could and couldn't go because those things were in specific areas of the forest and were capable of great evil. Her family home had burned down a few years before. That's why we were living in a trailer at that time on the property. My mom did end up calling the police that day, and they found the tornado straps that trailers have in Indiana that are concreted into the ground had been ripped in half. They were kind of amazed at that and took pictures. That same month in Rockville, Indiana, a few teenage boys were in a car, and one was almost pulled out of his window by something they all described as a gorilla-looking thing. Rockville is only about a 20-minute drive from where I live. To an even more surreal and downright outlandish encounter is claimed by a witness, who says that this occurred approximately 10 minutes outside of Port Renfrew on Vancouver Island, British Columbia, Canada, near the end of the Juan de Fuca River. At the time, she was with her partner trying out a new camper they had recently purchased, and she explains that they had an eerie feeling of being watched as soon as they arrived at the spot but just wrote it off to the isolation of the place and nerves. That evening, they were sitting around in the camper having a chat when the witness went out to relieve herself. She says she noticed what appeared to be sparks and flames coming up from down by the water. Things would spin wildly into the realm of the truly bizarre after that, and she explains. I was a bit freaked out as it's really close to our spot and there is absolutely nothing and nobody out this way, so I headed back in the van to tell my partner. I got back in, and that's when things got completely messed up. I started to see flashlights coming from the woods. It looked like a group of people, and I was starting to get really freaked out. I started to see flames coming as well, as if these people were holding both a mix of torches and flashlights. They were coming towards us and started surrounding the van. I thought we were never going to be able to leave. The same flames from a fire I saw coming from the river were now also surrounding the van. As if they set fire either below it or just surrounding it. From these flames, I saw the reflection of fire off of the figures. It was not pitch black like it should be. I could see the figures, their clothes, their outfits, and their faces. The first thing I saw was an archer. They were in green, and it almost looked like armor of sorts. They were wearing a mask. The mask was green with no special or intricate design, just the outline of a face. It grabbed an arrow from its back and aimed it at the van. I thought we were going to freaking die. Shadows were everywhere, as far as I could see each way. As they got close to the van, I could see them in their faces. Multiple red armored figures, a mix of knight armor and scales, came around, and they had guns on their backs. They had masks on too, but they looked red and made of wood, again not intricate but not as simple as the green face one. There were hooded figures. They would walk in the deeper parts of the forest and just stare. 3 or more of them came to the front of the van and just stared in. They saw me, and I saw them. They were violently pointing at me, and a few would point and then point at the exit of the site. I told my partner that they wouldn't stop pointing at me and indicating we should leave. He couldn't see any of them, he saw pitch black. There was so much going on besides these things. I saw dark, almost purple knights. They had the full attire uniform and faces covered. Larger figures, too large to be humans, were in similar outfits, but their armor had spikes coming from every limb and angle. They all would take turns staring in and pointing. The ones in hoods had cell phones or cameras of some sort that would show me their screen through the window. On their screen was just a view of the van and us on the inside. It was seriously messed up. Animals began running behind them. If I could describe them, it would be a mix between an oversized lion and a demon. They stayed farther away. All while this is happening, there are what looked like women and children, but mainly children, being brought through the forest and helped up the hill by these bear-looking creatures. 2 were black and the other gray. They had 4 limbs but were the height of a truck. What is all of this? It is also completely outlandish and absurd, so what could be going on here? The partner apparently didn't see any of this, but from her reaction of pure terror, he believed her and told her to cover her eyes and not look at any of it. However, no matter what she did, these entities continued to torment her relentlessly and did not stop until the sun began to come up. She says of their departure, "I sat up all night, terrified, either waiting for them to leave or for the sun to come up. It was the longest night of my life. As the morning broke, they began walking back into the forest. They didn't fade or disappear, they left. All until there was one hooded figure left. He stayed until the sun came just past his hood, showing me the terrifying pale and hairless face. They were gone, and so were we, leaving at about 8 a.m. when it was finally bright. Before we left, I saw symbols painted on the trees. I have searched everywhere online to find what they mean, but no such luck. I just don't know what that night means. The site and forest itself felt extremely evil, and I am unsure if something terrible happened there or if it was once a place of satanic worship." 3. This account is odd beyond reason, making one wonder if any of this happened or not, and if it did, what it could have been. Finally, we come to a very spooky account from a witness, which apparently happened on the island of Balangkayan, in the eastern Samar province of the Visayan Islands of the Philippines. Here, a group of missionaries had a compound in the wilderness on the fringes of a nearby settlement, and one day they were approached by a scared group of villagers who claimed that they needed the missionaries' help. They said that just a few days before, a group of guerrilla fighters had stumbled into their village bloodied and displaying gaping wounds that seemed as if they must have been inflicted by some powerful animal, but the soldiers had said this was no animal, that it had been a demon of the forest called the Hantu Rimba, and it had even violently killed one of their comrades. The villagers knew well of this creature because it had once terrorized them as well, but they had not heard from it in years, that is, until this day. According to the villagers, the frightened guerrillas had told them that they had been on patrol when something had leapt out of the shadows at them, half a man and half a creature of the wood, in so much as its limbs seemed to be coated with fungus and its nails more barbed thorns. Although they had not seen their team member actually die, he had been snatched away into the woods by the beast to be found later, little more than torn flesh and broken bones. According to them, this demon had once been a hermit by the name of Pharrell, who had become possessed by the supernatural entity. As the villagers excitedly told their story, the lead missionary, David Fletcher, listened on with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity, and he decided to go to their village and investigate. With the help of some village guides and accompanied by a village shaman, he was led toward where the demon was said to have its lair, at a remote cabin out in the woods. They arrived to find no sign of the Hantu Rimba, and indeed, the cabin did not seem to have been occupied in many years, almost totally swallowed by the encroaching, hungry jungle around it. So sure was Fletcher at this point that this was all a bunch of spooky superstition and mumbo-jumbo that he decided to camp out there in that dilapidated weed and vine-choked cabin that evening. It was a decision he would soon regret. In the very early morning hours, the men were awoken by a hideous, unearthly shriek from the wilderness, followed by what sounded like large stones pelting the cabin. This, the shaman said, was the demon itself, and Fletcher was so startled by the intensity of it all that he put all skepticism out of his head and began consecrating the cabin with prayer, but the screaming allegedly continued all night. In the morning, they made their way through the jungle towards a clearing that the shaman said he had seen in a vision the night before. The article explains. Although skeptical and a bit shy, Mr. Fletcher and the other elders trusted the man's spiritual gifts and followed him. Mid-afternoon, they came upon the grove of the elders' vision. It was a dark area covered in jungle growth, but there seemed to be some symmetry to the general layout of the area. It was as if the canopy of foliage covered a secret, hidden earthen work of unknown proportions. In the center, there was a medium-sized niche in the rock. The elder felt compelled to pray before it. As they did so, there seemed to be a shape forming in the darkness of the niche. And two cold, red eyes stared back at them. An ungodly howl echoed through the woods. But undaunted, Reverend Fletcher and the elders prayed and confined the spirit to the niche. Then they commanded it to leave. In a fury of violent sounds and a wind that seemed to lift the rotten growth from the ground, the evidence of a spiritual battle rattled the landscape. After a while, the wind and the prayers settled down. The elders went forth to the niche and immediately called to Reverend Fletcher. According to this account, they found within that niche the skeleton of the man once known as Pharrell, and not far away was the ravaged and mauled body of the missing gorilla. Fletcher and the others then consecrated the ground and blessed the area. The shaman performed a ritual, and they gave the remains a proper burial. After that, apparently no more was heard from the menacing Hantu Rimba. What is going on with this bizarre story? Was it ever even real at all? Here we have looked at just a sampling of some of the most off-the-wall bonkers accounts of what are described as forest demons. These are so incredibly odd that it is hard to even know where to begin in unraveling them, and they add to the sheer strangeness that the forests of our world generate from time to time. Are they real stories or just rantings and imaginings? I'll leave it for you to decide. Me and a friend hiked into a national forest right at dusk to do some climbing and rappelling the next day. We had gone to this place a few times before, but never at night, always on day trips. Because it was getting dark, we decided to walk down a set of old railroad tracks to get closer to the place. It was not a shortcut, but it was easier to walk the tracks than to climb. After a few hours of walking, we came to a spot along the tracks between a huge cliff face on the left and a river on the right when we saw a firelight in one of the big cliff shelters on the bluff. We stopped and listened, nothing. This in itself was freaky. We were in an extremely remote area, and there isn't any road leading to the top of this mountain where the fire was. We talked about it, and the curiosity in both of us prevailed. We dropped our packs before we ascended on the left side of the cliff face, and I noticed my friend grab his featherweight revolver out of his pack. I said, "Really, man?" And he said, "Better safe than sorry," and we started up. It was completely dark now, and when we reached semi-level ground near the very top, there were metal coffee cans burning what appeared to be kerosene or some kind of flammable liquid in random locations with no one in sight, no vehicles, no horses, nothing. Very quietly, we made our way to the edge of the cliff to see if we could look down at where the fire was on the side of the mountain. That's when we heard it, ducking, chanting and shitting in unison. We looked at each other with our WTF faces, then my friend immediately pulled out his gun, and I pulled out my knife. Not being able to see them looking down the side, we just had to get a peek. There were more coffee cans leading to a path to the shelter on the opposite side of the mountain than we came up with. As we got closer, you could hear the chants better, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. But the closer we got, I could tell this wasn't any kumbaya singing Boy Scout troop. My friend was in front of me, and when he came into view of them, he let out a "what the hell." I only saw one figure in a black robe stand up. We both turned around and hauled asses. We made it back down to our packs, and we looked up and didn't see a light anymore, even though it had appeared to be a big-ass campfire under the cliff shelter just moments before. While we were putting on our packs, I heard what I thought was a rock hit the tracks, and we figured they were throwing rocks at us. We continued to haul us back to the truck for another 10 to 20 minutes until we had to catch our breath and felt safe enough to stop. That was when we recounted everything we saw. He saw 4 figures, all in black robes. He never saw a face but did see hands. They were in a semicircle with the fire on the cliff edge and what he thought to be a small bear or hairy animal, and they were all kneeling around it. He also noticed the campfires go out simultaneously when we took off running. We got to the truck, left, and crashed at my house. The next morning, my brothers come over, and we both tell them about it. They wanted to go see the place, and I was somewhat reluctant but wasn't scared by any means. Maybe it's because I'm not afraid of anything when we're together, or because it's daylight, or both. We went by boat down the river till we saw the cliff face and walked up to the tracks and saw the decapitated head of a German shepherd, right where I heard something fall and thought they were throwing rocks down at us. We went up to the top, and there wasn't a trace of anything, no fire ash, no cans, no road or trail leading to the cliff, no tracks. I've worked my entire adult life in the Pacific Northwest woods, over 15 years in total, with about 7 years of that being for the Park Service at Olympic National Park. Many experiences over the years could warrant the title of creepy. This one in particular has always stuck with me. While working for the Park Service, one of my jobs was that of a restoration carpenter. We would travel to old backcountry historical cabins, emergency shelters, homesteads, and chalets, tasked with repairing and restoring them to their original, historically accurate states. This was a wonderful and demanding job. I'd spend 8 days at a time living off the beaten path, usually deep in the backcountry. Sometimes we'd be flown in supplies, sometimes we'd use llamas or mules to pack our gear. All the while sleeping in thinly walled single tents, cooking over a fire or whisper light stove, using the same tools and techniques the original homesteaders had at their disposal in the late 1800s to construct and survive in this unforgiving environment. One late fall, I was assigned to work near Lake Ozette at an old homestead off the trail, near the constructed boardwalk. For those unfamiliar with the area, Lake Ozette is 8 miles long and 3 miles wide. It sits as the largest unaltered natural lake in Washington. Lake Ozette has a long and rich history of Native American culture. The Makah Tribal Center in Nia Bay houses discoveries found in the area dating back 2,000 years, along with a local village that was well preserved over 300 years ago by a mudslide that left most of the artifacts intact. The Ozette Loop Trail, which the homestead was directly adjacent to, is approximately 9.4 miles through and through. The man-made boardwalk takes you under giant cedar groves and meanders through huge patches of chest-high salal before delivering you to Ahlstrom's Prairie, about 2.5 miles from the trailhead. Ahlstrom's Prairie, a giant soggy meadow, was once farmed by 2 Swedish immigrants. They constructed a small cabin and some outbuildings on the 150-acre bog. With cattle, sheep, vegetable gardens, and the help of a little Swedish ingenuity, they managed to etch out lives for themselves here for over 50 years. Over time, the forest, as it always does, decided to take back what was once its own. The now decade-long abandoned farm was hardly recognizable. Our job was to beat back the encroaching forest, put new windows in the main cabin, pipe in a new stove, apply fresh paint, and fix up portions of the semi-dilapidated barn. The ultimate goal is to allow guided tours to take place sometime in the future. For about 3 weeks, we stayed at the Ozette bunkhouse while working at Ahlstrom's. This was good duty for us. We weren't sleeping under the rain, our beds were warm, our hike was short, the terrain was not difficult, and we even had TV. The bunkhouse was located near the highway and ranger station. We would hike the 5-mile loop every day, bringing with us boards, tools, paint, and everything else we needed on our backs. These are full 10-plus hour days. We usually start our morning hike around 0700 and begin our evening return hike back to the bunkhouse around 1700. At one point during the fall, there were 4 of us working on this project, but at the time of this event, there were only 2 of us remaining. Most of the hard work had already been finished. We needed to hike a few last boards into the prairie to complete a portion of the woodshed before we called the job done. I volunteered to be the pack mule for the day, my only job being to carry as many boards as I could muster on each trip to the prairie before returning to the ranger station for the next load. It was late in the season for hikers at this point, the weather had turned, and we'd be lucky to see 2 to 3 people a day doing the loop. After around my 4th or 5th trip, I was pretty wiped. It was getting late in the evening now, around 1600, and my coworker had called it a day. I thought I could get one more trip in before it got too dark, my rationale being that the more trips I did today, the less I would have to do tomorrow. We passed on the trail. I told him my intentions and continued on. I delivered the last of the boards for the day, took a look around the prairie as the sun started to tuck behind the trees, and started my hour-long hike back to the ranger station. The lighting on the boardwalk was quite low at this point, with the cedars blocking most of the ambient light left by the setting sun and making visibility quite diminished. I'm not a nervous hiker and fail to spook easily, having solo hiked for weeks on end in the backcountry. I've been stalked by cougars, confronted by Kodiak bears in Alaska, and even ran into a few demented hillbillies over the years. As I left the prairie that evening, the hair on my neck stood on end, and goosebumps erupted from my forearms. An uneasy feeling swept over me. Suddenly, I wanted to walk faster, jog, then sprint. I didn't. Instead, I convinced myself that I'd been reading too many fantasy novels before bedtime. I walked another 5 minutes or so before I started to hear something faint, something that sounded like music. Impossible, I told myself, I'm the only one out here and still at least 2 miles from civilization, that civilization in reality being likely the only other soul out there, my coworker. Sure enough, however, I heard music, more specifically a piano. It started out so faint that I had to stop moving and actually try to hear it. The steps on the wooden boardwalk were too loud. Every time I paused to hear it, it became unmistakable. It got louder. I stood there, the sun now fully hidden behind the horizon, in total silence other than this piano. I became aware that there was no longer the noise of life, no birds, no insects, no wind, no rustling of leaves or underbrush, absolutely nothing other than the piano. It was as if everything was being weighted down by a fog of emptiness of some sort. I've encountered this dead time before in the woods, certain places have it, but this was somehow different, unique to this place, unique to this moment in time. I tried to focus on the keys, but I couldn't recognize the composition, which was surprising as I mostly listened to Metallica and Korn at the time. It was playing with a purpose, it was controlled, in tune, and thoughtful. It was a song, and somehow I felt that it was meant just for me in this moment. I started walking again, almost on key. The music once again got louder. As my pace increased, so did the tempo of the keys, still in tune and never faltering. It reached a climax, the perfect combination of my haste, my dread, my heartbeat, and the tempo of the music. Then, as quickly as it came, the piano stopped, whooshing away in a fraction of a second. It didn't trail off, it didn't fade into extinction, it was just gone. Suddenly, everything that was absent was swept away as if by a gust of wind. The stillness was gone, the gloom, the stagnation, and the weight of everything were lifted. My next step on the boardwalk was once again a reality. The evening was just as absent of light as before, but it felt like life, somehow, was once again injected back into the forest. The woods seemed normal again. I didn't hear the piano again that night, nor did I sense it. I told my coworker every detail when I reached the bunkhouse, and he showed no signs of disbelief. We didn't talk about it again until years later, when something similar happened to another Park Service employee. When I told my grandfather about what happened, as he was a retired park ranger who had worked nearby at Mora, the next station over, without the least bit of hesitation, he asked, "Did you hear the bagpipes along with it, or just the piano this time?" It seems, as I've learned and experienced since then, there is a lot more to that place, a lot more to the Olympics in general than anyone really knows or is willing to admit. When I was about 10, I was camping with my family at a place called Haines Island on the Alabama River. It is a dense, swampy area that is very secluded and floods easily, so most people who camp along the river choose one of the more populated RV campgrounds. That isn't my dad's style, though. When we camped, it was old school, rough-it style camping. Anyways, I was about 10, and I was at the little playground area at the campground, swinging and singing songs or whatever. I was there all alone. We were the only campers on Haines Island. It hadn't been dark when I came over to the playground, but darkness had taken over without me paying much attention. The playground opened to the camp trail on my right and was surrounded by wooded areas on 3 sides. Through the trees in front of the swing set was a bathroom/shower facility for campers. So I'm swinging, and all of a sudden I hear rustling coming from the bushes in front of me. I stopped swinging and got quiet, but I didn't see anything. I figured it was an animal and went back to swinging. This happened a few times. I would hear something, stop, listen, go back to swinging, hear something, stop, listen, and so on. I could see the bathroom facility's lights through the brush and the trees, but I didn't see anything moving in the bushes. I have an older sister and an older brother. I was 100% sure it was my brother hiding in the bushes, trying to scare me. Because I was so sure it was him, I walked straight to where I'd heard the noise coming from to let him know his plan was foiled. So I find myself at the edge of the woods, surrounded by these thick bushes, which are unkempt and completely swallow me. I yell out loud to my brother that I know he's trying to scare me, and he can go suck an egg. There's no answer. It is completely still and weirdly quiet. I mean, weirdly quiet. No more wind moving through the woods, no more creaking swings, no more insects, no more river sounds, just stillness. Dead silence. If my brother was just here trying to scare me, where did he go? Why was there no sign of him at all, no sound of retreating footsteps in the leaves? Even if he had disappeared without me seeing him, I definitely would have heard him running away. All the hair on my body stood up, and I froze. A voice, a raspy whisper, says my name in my right ear. I mean, I could feel this voice. It was icy, sending chills down the right side of my neck, over my right shoulder, and down my spine. I have chills right now, remembering it. It was like someone twice my height was hunched over behind me, their face way too close to my ear, almost touching me with their lips but not quite. I whipped around, prepared for a confrontation, except there was no one there. Nothing. The forest sounds returned around me, and I was standing alone in the woods. Whatever had been there with me was gone. I was not at all concerned with figuring out what had happened. I just knew I had to get away. I lit out of there like nobody's business and sprinted back to the campsite. Everyone was accounted for, including my brother, and I must have looked the way I was feeling because they immediately asked me what happened. I know a ghost whispered in my ear is a cliché spooky story, but I swear on a stack of Bibles this happened to me. To this day, I have no explanation. I went out into the woods with some friends on a hike. We started at the base of our campground, which was less than 10 feet from the trail because we were in the backpacker sites generally used by people doing the entire Shenandoah Trail from Maine to Georgia. We were maybe 16 or 17 at the most, I think closer to 15, and my friend's dad and little brother were in a full-fledged family site up at the top of the campground. The first night, a group of college-age boys doing the full trail helped us build a fire because there had been rain on the way up that got our wood we'd hauled in a little damp. One of them took me off onto the trail to show me how to find dry wood for the next night because they were moving on at dawn and wouldn't be able to help. Long story short, while we walked to get wood, he said there was a waterfall a mile or two down the trail that they'd passed on their way up and that it was a nice view and came from a spring with potable water if we wanted to do an easy hike. I went back and told my friends, who passed it on to my dad and brother, who didn't want to go, and we set off the next morning after breakfast, expecting to be back by lunch. I'll be honest, 2 of those kids were not made for hiking. Vastly out of shape, whiny, and unable to walk more than 10 feet without wanting a break, it definitely took longer than expected. But something vastly weird happened on that trail, and to this day, I can't explain it. I also can't confirm with the others, because 2 of them vanished off the face of the earth after graduating from high school and I haven't seen them in years, and the other doesn't really remember it other than recalling that it was awful. We started the hike with clear signs telling us the distance and followed the trail exactly. I was already an enthusiastic hiker at that age. My pride and joy bragging rights story was about doing Old Rag, a 9-ish mile loop trail somewhere in southern Virginia, with my mom on a trip once and completing it in about 4.5 hours. I knew how to follow a trail. But going down this trail, things got weird. It started to look more and more like we had somehow ended up on an animal trail, despite following clear signs and even being on a gravel path at one point that just dwindled. Anyway, it took at least an hour to get down to this waterfall, but there were dozens of people there. Apparently you can actually drive to it from one of the roads, which the backpacking guys didn't mention or didn't know since they must have crossed it at the beginning of the evening when the rain was likely enough to keep people away. We stayed for maybe 30 minutes and then got back on the trail, following another group. Less than half a mile in, out of nowhere, the group ahead of us turned a bend and vanished. But like I said, I was with 2 whiny teenage girls who didn't know how to hike and were stomping and dragging their feet about what was basically a nature walk. One of them ended up drinking most of my water as well as hers and begging me to carry it because it was too heavy for her. I figured the group must have just gotten out of sight because this girl was dragging her feet. We kept going up, with me taking the lead because I understood how to follow the trail. This is where it actually got creepy. We took the same route back and followed the same markers. For those of you who have done the Shenandoah trails, we were playing the tap game. For those of you who haven't, it's a game where the first person to see the paint lines on the trees marking the path kisses their hand and taps it for good luck, supposedly so you don't hurt yourself or get lost. Anyway, we just played because we were kids and it was a way to pass time. And yet the trail was decidedly not the same one we had come down. Same color indicators. Same entry points, same signs, same turns on the map. But the trail was just not the same. It was wider, with a steep hill on one side that shouldn't have been there because of what side of the mountain we were on. Logically, we should have had a cliff to our right. But instead, there was this great black hill. I spent some time in Huachuca with my dad when he was in the army, and we hiked those trails together. I remember the feeling we got before we saw the mountain lion following us. This oppressive, hunted feeling happened rather suddenly because the whole area went silent. No birdsong or anything. Then my dad saw the cougar a ways off on the ridge, walking parallel to us, and we left. Luckily, we weren't too far from the trail, so we were fine. This felt like that, but it was so much worse. Where we were, there was no large wildlife. No bears, no mountain lions, no wolves. Nothing big. But all of a sudden, the woods went silent. I couldn't even hear the stream anymore. My other friend, the one who actually hiked and could handle it, looked at me and kind of gestured to the hill. I don't know what the hell was following us. I still have no idea. It wasn't shaped like anything I've ever seen. It was this dark black thing the size of a small car, almost shapeless, like it was made of shadows and changed with the sunlight or something. I don't know. But it followed us from the base of the trail all the way back to the area where the trail T-boned with the path to our camp. The girls didn't seem to notice, but my hiker friend did, and he was shaking by the time we finally hauled their useless asses to the top. I was 100% sure we were going to die that entire time. When we saw a Boy Scout troop, I could have cried with relief. But that troop just looked at us and asked, "Is one of you a friend?" She kind of nodded and asked why, and the troop leader said, "Your dad has been looking for you. He was about to call the rangers to get search and rescue." We go hauling asses to her dad's camp, and there's already a ranger there. We tried to explain what had happened and where we went, and they just looked at us funny, like they thought we were lying, and insisted it was a 3-mile loop and we should have been back hours ago. It turns out we had been gone for almost 12 hours. None of us ever got hungry or too thirsty except the one girl, the boy hiker, and I never got tired. It was totally bizarre. I took a pen from the ranger and outlined exactly where we went, indicated the trailheads on the map, and everything, and they just looked at us like we were crazy. I ended up giving really specific details, down to the color of the trail markers, lavender, and had them tell me there's no such trail, no markers in that color, and that I must be confused or mistaken because that's not a trail in this park. That night, I checked my pedometer because it had one of those little indicators that said how far you'd traveled. 12 miles. I still don't know what ducking trail we were on or what that thing was. It was years ago, and I try not to think about it. I hike all the time still, and we did a bunch in Yosemite recently, and holy shit, Camp Curry is badass for all of you who like hiking, etc. It's like a tiny town. 10/10 would use it as my base camp again, but the lack of answers still bugs me. Whatever happened, we managed to go 12 miles over a 1.5-mile distance, all while being stalked by something I never got a good glimpse of, and I've never hiked with any of them again because it was terrifying and awful. Thanks, but I'll stick to going with experienced groups now because I don't want to die that way.